Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalatu wassalamu alayka ya Rasulallah wa ala alika wa sahabika ya Habiballah. It's a moment of heartfelt pride and elation for me to be addressing my viewers from the forum of Iqbal Academy, which is an internationally acclaimed forum for the promotion of Iqbal Rahmatullah alayhi's philosophy and thought. And after that, I am deeply grateful to Allah Almighty for accepting me to deliver this lecture on such a great visionary and revivalist personality like Allama Muhammad Iqbal Rahmatullah alayh, and talk about his most dynamic concept of the self. For me, this association, this nisbat and this humble service to Allama Rahmatullah alayh means a lot. I am further indebted to Dr. Baseera Ambreen, the director Iqbal Academy, who motivated and encouraged me to deliver this lecture. It is her motivation that made it possible for me to do so. And I'm thankful to my parents as well, who sowed the seed of love of Allama Rahmatullah alayh in my heart by introducing me to the poetry of Allama Rahmatullah alayh since the age of 4. When I was gifted the book Bangedra by my parents, which I used to read with deep reverence and devotion. So I can proudly claim that I have grown up with this devotion, love and reading of Allama's work at different stages of my life, starting from Bangedra's children poems and ending up with the most philosophical and radical work of Allama Iqbal Rahmatullah alayh, that is the reconstruction of religious thought in Islam. My today's lecture is basically about my MPhil research, which I conducted during the years 2004 to 6. I did my MPhil from Government College University, and while I was doing my coursework, I read Walt Whitman, who is an American poet of 19th century. His poem, The Song of Myself, was in our coursework. And when I read that poem, I found an amazing convergence of his views with that of Allama's poem, The Secret of Self. So at that very moment, I had thought that I will be doing my MPhil dissertation on this comparative study of the self in Allama Iqbal Rahmatullah alayh and Walt Whitman. So after completing my coursework, when I talked to my supervisor, Dr. Wasim Anwar, about this topic, he readily agreed to it, and I'm grateful to him as well for his cooperation. But after choosing this topic, I was a bit in a difficulty, because when I went to different scholars for assistance, for help, in order to clear my views regarding the philosophy of Allama Rahmatullah alayh, I was discouraged by all. That how come that you chose a person, one from Pakistan or from subcontinent and one from America, and how you are going to compare them. Okay, so I was a bit discouraged. But here I would like to mention that when I completed half of my research, I found an article by Herbert Reed, who is an renowned English critic, and he had written a one-page article where he talked about this similarity between Walt Whitman and Allama Muhammad Iqbal, and I would like to quote that. This ideal of Whitman is a critical ideal of workability, of direct use. Applying it here and now, I can think of only one living poet who in any way sustains the test, and almost necessarily he is not of our race and creed. I mean Muhammad Iqbal, whose poem Asrar-e-Khudi, The Secret of the Self, has recently been translated from the original Persian by Dr. Reynald Nicholson. Okay, so this finding of this article, it gave me a firm footing that whatever I had thought was not actually misleading, and I can work on that. Okay, so as far as the concept of the self is concerned, it is such a diversified concept which cannot be encompassed in one lecture. Okay, it is multi-layered, multifarious, multidimensional, and it has various aspects. But since I'm talking about, as is mentioned here, that I'm going to talk about the mystical self. I'm going to compare this mystical self in the poetry of Allama Muhammad Iqbal Rahmatullah Alayh and that of Walt Whitman. Now, as far as talking about self is concerned, for that again I would go back to the teachings of Holy Prophet, peace be upon him, as is mentioned in one of his hadiths, that man arafa nafsahu faqad arafa rabbahu. Okay, that the one who recognizes himself recognizes God. So as I was talking about this hadith, man arafa nafsahu faqad arafa rabbahu, that the one who recognizes himself recognizes God. Okay, so basically this journey of the selfhood or the voyage of self-discovery is actually a journey from the human self to the divine self, because the ultimate goal of human existence is the union with the higher self, with ultimate ego, which in Quranic terms we can call as al-haq, and if we talk about in terms of Whitman, we can call it as Santa Spirita or the oversoul, as these are the terms which have been used by Whitman. So when I started reading, when I started giving a deep reading to Whitman's philosophy and his biography, I found that he was also inspired by Maulana Jalaluddin Rumi and Sadi and Shirazi, and in his biographical work Democratic Vistas, in side notes I found references to Rumi. Okay, so that revelation or that finding was also amazing for me, and then I placed Rumi in the center. Because why Rumi was placed in the center? Because Whitman was also inspired by the thought of Rumi, and Allama Muhammad Iqbal's inspiration also goes back to Rumi, and he considered Rumi as his spiritual teacher, as we find many references in his poetry about that. Now, as far as this journey of the selfhood is concerned, it has many stages and it goes through many processes. And in my research, I have talked about the terminological differences and similarities between the concept of self between Whitman and Iqbal. Okay, so Whitman and Iqbal, Rahmatullah Alayh, they can be compared in so many ways. One way of comparing Whitman and Iqbal is by comparing them with regard to the many titles and labels that have been associated with them. And what Whitman says in Song of Myself can be applied to both Whitman and Iqbal, as Whitman says, and I quote, "I am large, I contain multitudes." Okay, so this saying of Whitman, it can be applied both to Whitman and Iqbal with regard to the, you can say, the greater spectrum of their thought and their philosophy. Another thing which is similar between the two is that both of them, Whitman and Iqbal, they have been divinized and demonized. Means that their thoughts, their philosophy is considered to be an elevated one, and they have borne a lot criticism on their philosophy of self as well. Okay, so one way of comparing them is comparing through these titles which are associated with them. Secondly, if we see from the historical perspective, Whitman appeared on the American literary scene when Americans were trying to solidify themselves as nation. So Whitman's voyage of self-discovery goes along with the American Voyage of Self-Discovery. And Whitman's discovery of himself is actually the discovery of the America as well. And Whitman has been given the status of a national poet. Similarly, Allama Iqbal Rahmatullah Alayh, whose poetry and philosophy appeared early in 20th century, this was the time when the Muslims of the subcontinent, they were in a period of transition, and there were many factors involved in that. One was World War I, and second was that the Muslims, they were in a way in a slumber, and Iqbal, through his radical philosophy, wanted to wake the Muslims from that slumber. And Allama Iqbal Rahmatullah has mentioned this in his book Reconstruction of Religious Thought in Islam, and I want to quote from there that since he was deeply concerned with the revival of the lost identity and status of Muslims, Iqbal, and he was very much disappointed with the Muslim religious philosophic tradition of his times, which he termed as worn out and practically dead metaphysics in Reconstruction. And according to him, it has a very deadening effect on the modern mind. And it was with his vibrant poetry that he stirred the dead into life and infused a renewing and rejuvenating spirit and a sense of identity and self-manifestation in his readers. Okay, so this brief sketch of Whitman and Iqbal, which I have done so far, it foregrounds the fact that in general terms, the poetic voice of the two has its seminal role in evolving the consciousness of their readers. Both performed the role of actually the vitalists in evolving the consciousness of the readers. And they wanted their readers to embrace life to the fullest by exploiting the unimaginable power of the self. And both emphasized the synthesis of spirituality and active and vigorous life in the world. Both earnestly preached the ideal of human unity and brotherhood, and both held firm faith in the infinite potentiality of the self. Okay, now after talking about these general similarities between Allama Muhammad Iqbal Rahmatullah Alayh and Walt Whitman, now I would specifically talk about the concept of the self. That how this concept of the self, it bears some terminological differences and similarities between Whitman and Iqbal Rahmatullah Alayh. First of all, the first thing that if we say that life is a voyage of self-discovery and the growth of selfhood is necessary, first we need to know what the self is. Not only the human self or the smaller self, but the higher self. This realization or this identification of the both is very necessary to start this journey. And for that, I would refer to that how these terms, they have been used both by Whitman and Iqbal in their poetry. Okay, so more specifically, this concept of the self, the central focus of Whitman and Iqbal's poetry, it also shares common as well as uncommon grounds. Both Whitman and Iqbal consider the self to be a composite of the physical and the spiritual self, but still there are terminological differences in their concept of the self. Similarly, they hold the same concept about the divine or the higher self or the ultimate ego or al-haq, that is God, all pervading force present in the universe. So they use the same medium, that is intuition and love, but their manner of getting in tune with the infinite is altogether different. Whitman becomes one with the higher reality by absorbing the self in the higher self. On the other hand, in Iqbal, the climax of the voyage of self-discovery is to absorb the self the higher self into the lower self, that is human self. Okay, so Whitman realizes selfhood by absorbing himself into God, whereas Allama Iqbal Rahmatullah Alayh realizes selfhood by absorbing God into himself. And this is what he has mentioned in one of his verses as well, as he says that Yazdam bakaman davar e himmate mardana, O man of courage, cast thy news on God. So, and moreover, this difference can also be explained with reference to again one of the verses of Allama Rahmatullah Alayh, as he says that kafir ki ye pehchan ke afaq mein gum hai, mumin ki ye pehchan ke gum usme hai afaq. So, this was a brief outline, and now I would talk about these concepts in detail. First of all, I would like to say that both Whitman and Iqbal Rahmatullah Alayh, they depart from traditional mysticism in their concept of selfhood, because they do not believe in self-annihilation or self-negation. Rather, they believe that self-assertion is self-possession. Okay, and they both believe in this, in a kind of a balance between temporal and spiritual life. As Whitman asserts in Song of Myself that I am the poet of the body, I am the poet of the soul. And for Iqbal also, the world of matter is not an illusion, but if ignored, all progress would cease. For him, both body and the soul are the expression of the same reality. They are constituted of the same stuff. He defines the relation of the body and the soul on the analogy of the relation of God with the universe. He states in Reconstruction of Religious Thought in Islam, and I quote, "It is not placed at some definite or particular point in the body. It is not identical with body either. It is related to it. It is in contact with every atom of it, permeates and infuses it through, and at the same time is over and above it. It is neither inside nor outside the body, neither proximate nor separate from it, and yet it is in contact with its every atom. Hence, body is necessary for the expression and manifestation of the soul." Whitman's notion of self-assertion is also evident in his preface to 1876 edition of his book Leaves of Grass, which contains his poem Song of Myself, and where Whitman insists that his enclosing purpose is to express above all artificial regulations and aid the eternal bodily character of one's self. So, the self that Whitman asserts is no doubt the transcendental or mystical self, but it can only be realized or revealed through the physical self. Unlike traditional mystics, Whitman did not regard flesh as a matter of hindrance in spiritual aspirations towards the ideal, but he regarded the material reality as the glorious means of life. As one of the critics says about Whitman, that he does not negate life, but in his quest of self, he has a lusty enthusiasm, a hearty relish for life lived at all times to the fullest intensity. So for him, it is not just the spiritual self that comes in communion with the oversoul, but the physical and the spiritual self in their unison or in their totality get in tune with the infinite during the mystical experience. So after this, another important point related to this is that their concept of the self must not be confused with that of egotism. Okay? Because in his poetry, Whitman's pronominal assertion of his I is not egotistical self-assertion, but has large universal parameters that can be understood only by placing the self of Whitman in a vaster mystical and metaphysical context. Because similarly, in comparison, when we come to Allama Iqbal Rahmatullah Alayh's poetry, in his poetry specifically in The Secret of the Self, he encapsulates the idea of self-assertion as self-possession. When he talks about this assertion, he says, and I quote, Endeavor to surge and wrestle with the sea. Oh, expand thyself, move swiftly. Be a cloud that shoots lightning and shed a floor of the rain. Let the ocean sue for thy storms as a beggar. Let it complain of the straightness of thy skirts. So this is how Allama Rahmatullah Alayh also believes in self-assertion as self-possession. Now, this consciousness of the self is the ultimate human goal, and this continuation of individual life, it depends on the affirmation of the self. And this is what Allama Rahmatullah Alayh says in The Secret of the Self, and I quote, "'Tis the nature of the self to maintain itself. In every atom slumbers the might of the self. Power that is unexpressed and inert chains the faculties which lead to action, in as much as all life comes from the strength of the self. Life is in proportion to this strength. When life gathers strength from the self, the river of life expands into an ocean." And he also makes a clarification in one of his lectures in 1937 that when I condemn self-negation, I do not mean self-denial in the moral sense. For self-denial in moral sense is a source of strength to the self. In condemning self-negation, I am condemning those forms of conduct that lead to the extinction of the I as a metaphysical force. For its extinction would mean its dissolution, its incapacity for personal immortality. The ideal of Islamic mysticism, according to me, my understanding, is not the extinction of the I. The idea of Islamic mysticism is a stage beyond the stage of extinction, that is immortality, which from my point of view is the highest stage of self-assertion. Ethically, the word khudi means self-reliance, self-respect, self-confidence, self-preservation, and even self-assertion. So here Iqbal very clearly explains his idea of self-assertion. So the crux that we can extract from these sayings of Iqbal and Whitman is that the realization of the self, can only be done through its assertion, and this is the highest spiritual ideal of human life. And these poets, they are making their readers conscious of it. Then moving forward, regardless of their geographical, cultural, chronological distances, the notion of the self, it in inner cognizance of the truth brings them closer to each other. And as mystics, they versify unity through cosmic and universal forms of love, celebrating every bit of creation and concerned with the elevation of the whole human race, and not of the few supermen like Nietzsche. Okay, so here, with reference to Nietzsche, I would like to mention one very important fact about the Secrets of the Self by Allama Iqbal Rahmatullah Alayh. When Allama Rahmatullah Alayh's this poem, Secret of Self, when it was translated by Dr. Nicholson, an English novelist and critic, E.M. Forster, made a comment about it. After reading the English translation of the poem, and I quote his words. He said, Iqbal completed his education in Europe, and like others of his compatriots, he had been influenced by Nietzsche, and he tries to find in that rather shaky ideal of the Superman a guide. But Allama Rahmatullah Alayh, he denounced and he rejected this similarity of his concept of self or the perfect man with that of Übermensch or the Superman of Nietzsche. And I think one of his verses in Jibril, it clearly reveals this fact or makes us clear when he says that about Nietzsche, that होता अगर वो मजजूब फ़िरंगी इस ज़माने में, मैं उसको बताता कि मुकामे किब्रिया क्या है. Okay, so when Iqbal says this, his thought definitely could not be derived from that of Nietzsche's Superman. And he very strongly rejected it. And I would quote his words. As Allama Rahmatullah Alayh says, some of English reviewers have been misled by the superficial resemblance of some of my ideas to those of Nietzsche. And he says that he suggested that a more accurate and authentic source of his notion of ego or khudi is the Sufi doctrine of the perfect man or insan-e-kamil. And here I would like to mention that actually Allama Rahmatullah, for him the concept of the perfect man, it goes back to that of the ascension of Holy Prophet, peace be upon him. For him that is the zenith point or the peak point of human elevation, where a human being can reach, and we can very proudly claim this, that we are the followers of, we are the ummati of Pyare Nabi Pak sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and he is the only human being on this earth who could achieve that zenith point or the peak point of human existence. And he is the one who can be truly called as insan-e-kamil or the perfect man. So, for the realization of the selfhood, as I mentioned earlier, it is very important to see the concept of God in case of Whitman and Iqbal Rahmatullah Alayh. And here again, I would like to mention this fact, and I would just briefly outline the concept of God given by Allama Iqbal Rahmatullah Alayh and Walt Whitman, and those who are interested to read it in detail, they can get hold of my research and see it in detail. Here again, both Whitman and Iqbal, they depart from traditional mysticism in their concept of self, in their concept of the divine or higher self, because in traditional concept, either God is considered as immanent or transcendent, as we are familiar with the philosophy of Wahdatul Wujud and Wahdatul Shuhud. Wahdatul Wujud, that is polytheism, which says that God is immanent, and Wahdatul Shuhud says that God is transcendent. Now, for Allama Iqbal Rahmatullah Alayh and for Walt Whitman as well, God is both immanent and transcendent. In the world of time and space, God is transcendent, and in the world of spacelessness and timelessness, God is immanent. Okay, so and in fact, when we say that God is both immanent and transcendent, and those Sufis who believe in these different schools of thoughts related to this concept of the divine, both are right, because these are actually the different stages in the realization of the selfhood, that where one realizes only that God is immanent, and when one realizes that God is transcendent, and there is another one who realizes that God is both immanent and transcendent. So those who believe that God is immanent, they can be termed as pantheists. And Whitman has also been called as pantheist, and about Allama Iqbal Rahmatullah Alayh also, at one point in time it was said that he was pantheist. But later, when he developed his philosophy, he moved from this viewpoint from pantheism to panentheism, and that fact is also mentioned in his poetry. Now, Allama Iqbal's view about God, it also departs from traditional concept of the divine. He believes that God has a creative, dynamic life that is both permanent, and changing, as creation is the unfolding of the inner possibilities of God in a single yet continuing act. And this can be verified by another verse of Allama rahmatullah alayh कि ये कायनात अभी ना तमाम है शायद आ रही है दमदम सदाए कुन फयाकून. So his concept of divine was inspired from the Quranic proposition that God is the light of the heavens and of the earth. His light is like a niche in which is a lamp, the lamp encased in a glass, the glass as it were a star. So according to Iqbal, this verse strengthens the view of God as the ultimate ego. Iqbal considers God's creative energy as a dynamic driving force in the universe, revealing it every moment. God is present in full glory all the times. The concept of now and then, past and present and future, they lose meaning in Iqbal's understanding of God. So God is approachable all the times, and though the means of approaching can be different. As far as Whitman's concept of divine is concerned, Whitman follows transcendental tenets in his rejection of the narrow orthodox Christian concept of God. Although transcendentalism, it holds a broader conception of seeing God in his creation and not only as the creator, and hence relocates Godhead in the self. Emerson also, Ralph Waldo Emerson, who is the founder of Transcendental School of Thought, he also holds this view of the transcendence of God. So basically Whitman took inspiration from there, and then we also find a seeming affinity between the Vedantic mysticism and transcendentalism, but in a way Whitman departs from both. And there is one fundamental difference between Emerson and Whitman regarding their concept of the divine. So he is also, like Allama Iqbal rahmatullah alayh, he is also a panentheist rather than a pantheist. Now after this realization of the process of selfhood, or after this realization that a voyage of self-discovery has to be taken up and self has to be asserted, and after knowing or identifying that higher self, God, the next step that is involved in the growth of the selfhood or in the realization of the selfhood is love. And Allama Iqbal rahmatullah and Walt Whitman, they both believe that love is the central force, and without love one cannot realize oneself. Now again, they both depart from the traditional concept, since they are revivalists, they are radical in their philosophy, so they depart from traditional concept of love. For them, love is a dynamic force which actually stirs man to action. It's not which makes one passive, but it actually inspires action and creativity. And for, as I mentioned, that for Allama Iqbal rahmatullah alayh, journey to the selfhood begins with love. As he has mentioned in his poem, The Secret of Self, and I quote, the luminous point whose nature is the self is the life spark beneath our dust. By love it is made more lasting, more living, more burning, more glowing. From love proceeds the radiance of its being and the developments of its unknown possibilities. Its nature gathers fire from love. Love instructs it to illuminate the world. The harder rocks are shivered by love's glance. Love of God at last becomes wholly God. So love is that fundamental urge of being. It is the pulsation and foundation of life. And here I would like to quote Allama's verses from his poem Mas Cardova, which are a celebration of love. मर्द खुदा का अमल इश्क से साहब फ़रोग, इश्क है असले हयात, मौत है उस पर हराम। इश्क की तक़वीम में असरे रवां के सिवा और भी ज़माने हैं जिनका नहीं कोई नाम। इश्क दमे जिब्राइल, इश्क दिले मुस्तफ़ा, इश्क खुदा का रसूल, इश्क खुदा का कलाम। इश्क फ़कीह हरम, इश्क अमीर जुनूद, इश्क है इब्न सबील, इसके हज़ारों मुकाम। इश्क के मिज़राब से है नग़मा तारे हयात, इश्क से नूरे हयात, इश्क से नारे हयात। ए हरम कुर्तबा, इश्क से तेरा वजूद, इश्क सरापा दवाम, जिसमें नहीं रफ़्तो बूद। Okay? So love transcends all time and space. It brings man to a universal plane. So love is that a fundamental urge of being, which is important for the realization of selfhood. And here I would also like to mention that as far as Allama Iqbal Rahmatullah Alayh is concerned, his poetry, it radiates with the love of Pyare Nabi Pak Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. Okay, so and I feel that there are many titles which are associated with Allama Iqbal Rahmatullah Alayh, but his true identity, or his if we truly place him with regard to his philosophy or his mysticism or his poetry, we can call him as a great lover of Holy Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. And this Ishq-e Rasool, or love of Holy Prophet, is the crux of his philosophy of self. Okay, as he mentions in The Secrets of the Self, and I quote, दर दिले मुस्लिम मुकामे मुस्तफ़ा अस्त, आबरूए माँ ज़िनामे मुस्तफ़ा अस्त. In the Muslim's heart is the home of Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. All our glory is from the name of Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. Okay, so this journey of the selfhood, it is not possible without love. Then another point of comparison between Whitman and Iqbal is that both of them, they believe that self can be realized not through intellect but through intuition. It is the intuition which can make you realize the selfhood, not the intellect, because intellect has limitations, whereas love or intuition is all expanding, and it is limitless, and it has a greater spectrum. So this was another point of comparison between the two. So whether the self is composite of body and soul, and in case of Whitman it's a metaphysical reality, or in case of Iqbal it is appreciative self, both Whitman and Iqbal, they present the self as moving back and forth between the consciousness and unconscious, between the spiritual and physical, between itself and its immortal source, that is the oversoul or the ultimate ego. Therefore, the self celebrated in the poems of Whitman and Iqbal is a universal self. This metaphysical and universal self, it provides the key to the most fundamental affinities between these two poets. So, in this lecture, I have tried to briefly outline some of the similarities and differences between Walt Whitman and Allama Iqbal Rahmatullah Alayh. One fact that I would like to mention over here, and that actually inspired me to do this research, that when I started reading criticism on Walt Whitman, I found that a lot of work has been done on finding the Vedic roots of Whitman, It means that his thought has been compared to with that of Hindu mysticism, like Upanishad and Gita, but no one has tried to find this similarity between Walt Whitman and Muslim Sufi thought. This has been ignored, I feel, that deliberately in the critical enterprise, that no critic has talked about it. Okay, so I thought it as my responsibility to find these connections between the two and bring to foreground this bring to foreground this debt of Whitman to that of Muslim Sufism. And for me, this project, this research was more like a voyage of self-discovery also, and for filling this gap in the critical enterprise. And moreover, there was another purpose for which I did this research, कि अगरचे बुत हैं जमात की आस्तीनों में, मुझे है हुक्म अज़ां ला इलाहा इल्लल्लाह. So for this purpose I conducted this research, and what was ignored in criticism, I brought it to the forefront, that how Walt Whitman was inspired first by Rumi, and how Allama Iqbal rahmatullah was also inspired by Rumi, that how Rumi is a bridge which actually connects both Walt Whitman and Allama Iqbal rahmatullah alayh. So this was the basic purpose of this research, and towards the end of this lecture I would like to address the youth of Pakistan. Since I am a teacher, I have been working as a teacher for the past 20 years, and for me, teaching is in prophetic tradition. It is not just a profession. For me, it is my passion, and through this profession I want my youth to realize their real purpose of life. And I think that we are blessed that we have been given, we have been endowed, we have been granted with the visionary like Allama Iqbal rahmatullah alayh. But unfortunately we ignore his teachings, his futuristic poetry. Whenever we you see verse of Iqbal, when you read it, you find it relevant to the present times. So that is basically the, you can say, the beauty of a poet, that how he can be associated with all times. He is not limited. Okay, so we are blessed, and we should pay attention to, and we should not ignore the thought or the philosophy of Allama Iqbal rahmatullah alayh. As he himself said that मेरी नवाए परेशान को शायरी ना समझ कि मैं हूँ महरमे राज़े दरूने खाना. So his is not only a poetry which can only be enjoyed as a piece of poetry for its own sake, but it's a message, it's a distillation of Quran and Hadith. So we need to go back to our roots. We should not ignore these roots of ours. And here again, I would also like to mention another fact, that when I started my research, I came to know that in America they celebrated the decade of Rumi from 1990 to 2000. They celebrated this whole decade as the Rumi decade, and they promoted the teachings of Maulana Jalaluddin Rumi. And we being Muslims, we being Pakistanis, we are not aware of it. If I ask any of my students or any young girl or boy that what do you know about Rumi or Masnavi Maulana Rum, have you ever read that? The answer is a big no. So we need not ignore our roots, because we can only sustain in this world when we are tied to our roots. ठीक है, जैसे कि एक पौधा जो अपनी रूट्स के साथ जो स्टक होता है, जो उसके साथ टाइड होता है, it can sustain it or the atrocities of the weather. ठीक है, अदरवाइज फिर ऐसे ही है कि इधर की हवा चलेगी तो इधर को, और उधर की हवा चलेगी उधर को, और जो हमारी यूथ के साथ है और फिर वो होता है कि कौवा चला हंस की चाल तो अपनी भी भूल गया. ठीक है, said that we are neither type of a road tradition, we are an amalgamation and we do not have any firm footing. ठीक है, so it is only our root, our religion, or the teachings of Holy Prophet, peace be upon him, they can only provide us firm footing or a firm standing, and we need to go back to all this in order to earn respect, not only in this world but in the next world as well. Thank you.